144, but rather than hear only words of liturgy, we have a tradition now of hearing stories from our congregation. And I'm delighted to call forward Shula Bernard to share her family's story from the beginning of the 20th century. Okay. You're good.
The rabbi asked me to do this. I told him that I wanted to write things down for my children, and I did, and I wrote and I wrote and I wrote, and I sent it to the rabbi, and he very nicely said, I'm not sure we have 3 hours, so I'll share with you some of their story. My parents, Mordechai, Yaakov, and Chana, Zichronam Livracha, came from Carpathian Ruthenia. It's a region that's now part of Western Ukraine, and it's been described as a borderland where there's been a Jewish presence for over 500 years and where sovereignty changed so often that it was said that you could live in multiple countries without ever leaving your home. When my parents would tell me stories of their childhood, they would mention the poverty, but mostly with love and Yiddish humor. They would talk about their large family and their close-knit religious community. Listening to their stories, I would imagine a place very much like that captured by the stunning photographs taken by Roman Vishniak of A Vanished World. My mother came from a small shtetl called Terablia, where there was no electricity and no running water, and my father from a village a little more than 20 kilometers away called Tyachev. In November of 1938, that world ended. The region was handed over to Hungary, and as Hungary increasingly aligned with Nazi Germany, it adopted a series of anti-Jewish measures, and one of these was forced labor service for Jewish men of military age. My grandfather and then my teenage father were forced into these battalions. The day my father left for the labor battalion was the last time he was to see his parents, his home, and most of his 10 siblings. My father said that they were forced to work 12 to 14-hour days doing heavy manual labor, building roads, bunkers, and bridges, given little food and always under the watch of Hungarian guards. He also described how, to his surprise, one of the Hungarian guards would hand him a plate after he ate his midday meal and order him to clean it. And as my father did, he saw that the guard left some uneaten food. It wasn't only once, my father would say. He kept doing that. When I asked him why he thought the guard was doing this, he answered, maybe I reminded him of someone, or maybe he had a son my age and he felt sorry for me. But the food he left on the plate helped to keep me alive. My father escaped from work battalion along with 2 other teenage boys. He remembered how they were chased by guards and dogs, but hid in the forest under thickets and leaves, and they made their way east. They were captured by a band of partisans accused of being Germans or Hungarians and nearly killed, but convinced them that they were Jews escaping from the Hungarians and were allowed to stay, which they did, until word came out that a General Svoboda was forming a Czech brigade as part of the Soviet army and was recruiting Czechs who had run away and escaped the German invasion to join him. My father, along with his 2 friends, were eager to join the fight, and they found themselves in the 1st Czech Army Corps, provided with uniforms and guns, the only 3 Jews in their unit. I thought my father's story, being in the Czech Army Corps, was unusual, but then I read Erich Kalka's book titled Jews in Svoboda's Army in the Soviet Union and learned that there were hundreds, if not thousands, of Jews who fought in Svoboda's army and that they played a significant role in major battles liberating Ukraine. My father never said much about this time in the Czech army, but that changed when we were on a trip to Eastern Europe with my parents for my father's 80th birthday. Steve and I were traveling with them by train from one city to another when my father began telling us how he got to be in Svoboda's First Army, how he and along with others in his battalion were sent out on dangerous reconnaissance missions behind enemy lines, and how many in his unit did not survive. He described how he carried an automatic rifle and emphasized that it had 75 rounds and how he was wounded in the leg, treated in the field, and sent right back to the field. He then continued, saying that one day he and a few others overpowered a nest of German machine gunners. The German soldiers came out with their hands up, holding up a white flag. I asked him what happened next. He made the motion and the sound of a machine gun in our train compartment. I killed them, he said. I had to. They would have killed me. All my life, I knew my father as someone who's quiet and a gentle man with a beautiful voice who managed to survive a horrible time. But at the age of 51, I learned that my father fought against Nazis, survived against all odds, and mowed down German soldiers who were holding up a white flag. I'm not sharing this to judge or justify, but to consider what war does even to those who are its victims. My father was with the Czech Brigade when Svoboda and the Soviet Army liberated Prague in May of 1945. That summer before he was discharged from the military, my father would meet trains coming into Prague from Soviet liberated areas. He was constantly searching for anyone he would recognize from home. And that's where my father was when he and my mother met. But my mother's journey to Prague was quite different. My mother's father was also forced into Hungarian labor battalions, leaving my grandmother to take care of 6 children, 5 girls, including my mother, and the youngest, a boy who was barely 4 years old, as well as elderly parents. She managed the household until July of 1941, when she and she and the family were among some 18,000 Jews randomly assigned by the Hungarians as foreign nationals, despite having lived in the region for generations, and were kicked out of their homes and deported to Kamenets-Podolsk. The Hungarians handed them over to Nazi killing brigade known as the Einsatzgruppen, organized by Himmler and Heydrich for the sole purpose of exterminating Jews and others deemed undesirable. My mother would tell me of that late July day when Hungarian soldiers came to order them to pack. They were being relocated. They were to pack lightly, take food for 3 days, and not to worry. They'd be given what they needed when they got to where they were going, but they had no idea where they were going. My nearly 17-year-old mother, along with her family and most of the Jews living in the town, were trucked 11 kilometers to Bushtina, where there was a railway station, where they were herded onto trains along with other Jews from the surrounding region. I wish I knew more of what that train ride was like and what my mother and her family felt as they were taken east. What I do know is that my mother said they were frightened and didn't know where they were being taken. They traveled for 2 days and 3 nights. It was dark when they got on the train and dark when they arrived at their destination, where they were herded through a line of guards and barking dogs as they left the train. They had no way of knowing that what was awaiting them in Kamenets-Podolsk, that in a few weeks, on August 25th, 1941, their fates would be sealed when SS Obergruppenführer pledged to finish murdering by September all the Jews turned over by the Hungarians. On August 26th to 27th, the Einsatzgruppen implemented the first mass killing of this scale, where it's estimated that over 23,000 persons were murdered. The 18,000 Jews handed over by the Hungarians and the remainder local Jewish residents of Kamenets-Podolsk. These massacres conducted by the Einsatzgruppen, sometimes with the help of local police, have been described as the Holocaust by bullets in a moving book of that title written by Father Patrick Du Bois. While Kamenets-Podolsk was the first of these massacres, it was certainly not the last. The largest occurred at Babin Yar a month later, when over 33,000 Jews were shot and killed in the outskirts of Kyiv. It's been estimated with Ukraine and other countries bordering Russia, peppered with similar sights. My mother would tell me how worried and frightened her mother was about what was to happen to them. She was especially worried for my mother because word spread that the guards raped and then murdered young girls. My grandmother begged and pleaded with my mother to run away, saying that one of her children had to survive, that someone had to tell the world what was happening. Years later, my mother's voice still quivered as she would tell me how the two of them cried and argued. My mother didn't want to leave her family, didn't want to abandon her mother or siblings, but her mother was insistent, and finally, along with two others, they planned an escape. They didn't have a map. They didn't have a clear idea of where they were or how they would manage, but my mother was told to run away to Budapest. And one night, she and the other young women ran into the forest. It took them nearly 3 months to travel the 750 kilometers to Budapest. They foraged for food, took clothes from clotheslines along the way so they could blend in with local peasants, and moved mostly at night. My mother told me of a time they hid in the loft of a barn. Their presence unsettled the cows, and the farmer and his wife discovered them hiding. The wife told her husband to send them away. She was too frightened to help them, and reminded her husband of how people were being killed for helping Jews. But the farmer wanted to help, and his wife finally agreed to give them food. And my mother would tell me they were sent on their way with freshly baked bread and other provisions. Not long after their escape from Kamenets-Podolsk, they encountered several men who managed to survive the massacre. The men somehow escaped being shot, but were pushed into craters by falling bodies of those around them who were shot. During the night, they climbed over dead or dying bodies, retrieved some clothing, and made their way to the forest. This was how my mother found out what happened to her mother, her sisters, and her brother. Many times over the years, she would tell me that the ground shook and heaved for 3 days following the massacre. My mother made her way to Budapest, connected with a Jewish community, received help finding temporary lodging and work, and eventually was taken in by a wealthy childless Jewish couple who protected her not only during the war, but when the Nazis began deporting people Jews from Budapest. After Budapest was liberated, my mother was eager to find her family, return to the shtetl, and begin a new life. But when she got to the shtetl, she found that her father, although he survived Auschwitz, he began a new life with a woman who helped him, and she decided that she couldn't stay in the town with him. She left feeling alone, restless, and unsettled. She continued moving, traveling by trains all over areas liberated by the Soviet army, and eventually wound up in Prague, where my father was meeting trains. My father claims that he recognized my mother immediately as someone from near his home, and within a week, he began introducing her to his friends as his Kala. When I asked him what attracted him to her so quickly, he said, "She was from my home." My mother described him as thin and a thin rail and red hair and freckles, and claimed she was on the rebound from a Budapest romance and not really interested. But then she added more seriously, "I was alone in the world. I needed to belong to someone. I needed to belong somewhere." So they married and were together for the next 63 years. My parents' story continues with them eventually making it to Paris, connecting with the Haganah, being sent to Marseille, being on one of the ships named Yagur, and being part of the clandestine, what was termed the illegal immigration, being sent to Cyprus, where my brother was born, along with 2,200 other babies of Holocaust survivors who were born in Cyprus. Eventually, they made it to what was then the Palestine Mandate, taken in by Kibbutz Ramat Rachel, and were there in the hills overlooking Jerusalem when Israel was declared a state and Ramat Rachel was attacked. I was born a few years later, and then my father learned that his older brother Leibish survived the death march from the death camp at Mauthausen, and that his sister Ilana, was among those rescued by Raoul Wallenberg and survived the war in Sweden. They, along with a few other relatives, made their way to the United States, and my father was desperate to join them. So in 1960, we came to this country, and my parents lived in very close proximity, lived and argued with their family till the end of their lives. For over 3 decades, I've had the privilege of serving on our Chevra Kadisha, along with the most amazing group of thoughtful, respectful and kind people. People come to participating in this mitzvah for a number of reasons. For me, the most compelling has always been the desire to provide for our community what many members of my family, as well as so many Jews during the Holocaust, were unable to receive. There was no tahara. There were no tachlichim. There was no mournful chanting of the El Mali Rachamim as my grandmother and her children went to their deaths, experiencing unspeakable horror. As they became increasingly frail, my parents moved to be near me and Steve. They spent the last few years of their lives in our community. At the end of their lives, my parents were taken care of by our Chevra Kadisha, by those I have known and respected for decades. My family and I were comforted by our community, by our rituals, and by the knowledge that they're buried in a Jewish cemetery. I'd like to end with a quote from a recent article about Rabbi Delphine Horvilor, the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors and a Reform rabbi in Paris, who so eloquently speaks what I've always felt. I was brought into the world with an unspoken knowledge of tragedy. I was clearly aware, even as a child, that ghosts haunted my life. I think I'm trying to attend funerals that never took place. It is definitely haunting that the Shoah left us with millions of unburied souls, and it should continue to haunt us all. I wish all of you a Shana Tova, Gmar Chatima Tova.